They dragged her off the wagon like she didn't belong to the living, and by sundown, the man who picked her up would lose everything the town ever gave him. The wheels creaked to a stop under the hard noon sun, heat rising off the dirt like a warning no one listened to. And there she was, Clara Whitfield, laid down not gently but not cruelly either, just dismissed, like a chair with a broken leg left out back behind a saloon. Her dress coated in travel dust, her hands still gripping the edge of the wooden frame as if she might pull herself back into a world already moving on without her. The wagon driver didn't meet her eyes, didn't say her name, just adjusted his hat and climbed back up. Because in places like this, stopping too long for someone who couldn't stand was how you fell behind yourself, and nobody wanted that. Not in a town that measured a man by how much he could carry and how fast he could move. The horses shifted, leather straps creaked, and the wagon rolled forward. Slow at first, then steady, then gone, leaving her in the middle of the road where the dust settled like silence. People watched. Of course they did, from shaded porches and half-open windows, hands resting on railings worn smooth by years of leaning and judging. No one spoke, not because they didn't have words, but because saying something would mean doing something, and doing something meant choosing a side, and no one wanted to choose hers, not hers. Not a woman who couldn't walk, not someone who would need lifting, feeding, waiting, time nobody believed they had. The sun climbed higher, shadows shrinking under boots and barrels, and still she didn't ask for help. That was the part that made some of them uncomfortable. She didn't beg, didn't call out, just sat there with her back straight against the wagon rut, eyes forward like she had already learned what happened when you asked and no one answered. And maybe that's why Ethan Cole stopped, or maybe it was something older than reason, something quieter than kindness. He had been walking past with a length of pine balanced on his shoulder, the smell of fresh cut wood still clinging to it, hands rough from years of shaping things meant to hold weight, to carry, to last. He saw her the same way he saw a beam set wrong in a house frame, not as a burden, but as something that would change everything if left the way it was. He paused, just one step longer than anyone else would have allowed themselves, and that pause was enough for the town to notice. You could feel it, the shift, like wind changing direction before a storm. Someone muttered under their breath, not loud, just enough, "Leave it, Cole," because they all knew what stepping toward her meant. It meant stepping away from them, from work offers, from quiet nods in the morning, from the kind of belonging that didn't look like much until it was gone. Ethan didn't answer. He never did much talking when a thing was already clear. He set the pine board down against a post, slow, careful, like it mattered, like everything he touched had a place it deserved to rest. Then he walked into the road, boots pressing into dust that hadn't settled yet. Each step measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just decided. When he reached her, he didn't look around for approval, didn't check who was watching. He just crouched down, close enough to see the lines of exhaustion on her face, the way her fingers trembled slightly from holding on too long to something already gone. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, steady, the kind of voice used in workshops where sharp tools didn't forgive mistakes. Her eyes shifted to him then, not wide, not hopeful, just aware, like she was taking measure of him the same way he had taken measure of her. A long second passed, maybe two. The town held its breath without knowing it was doing so. And then he did the one thing no one else had been willing to do. He reached out, not quick, not sudden, just enough for her to see it coming, enough for her to refuse if she wanted to, but she didn't move away, and that was all the permission he needed. He slid one arm behind her back, the other beneath her knees that didn't answer to her anymore, and lifted, careful, balanced, like he was carrying something fragile but not broken, something that still had a purpose even if the world had decided otherwise. The weight settled against him, lighter than expected, heavier than it should have been. And as he stood, dust falling from her dress in soft clouds, you could hear it, the shift in the town, not loud, not spoken, but real, like a door closing somewhere far off, a line drawn without chalk, without words, just understood. Ethan Cole had chosen, and by choosing her, he had stepped outside everything that made a man safe in a place like this. He turned without looking back, carried her toward the edge of town, where his small workshop leaned into the wind like it had something to prove. And behind him, the silence followed, thick, heavy, watching, because everyone knew something had just changed. They just didn't know yet who it would cost the most. The workshop smelled of pine and old iron, the kind of place where things were fixed instead of replaced, where broken pieces were measured twice before anyone decided they could not be saved. Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there, setting her down gently on a wide workbench that still held scattered wood shavings from the morning. Sunlight slipped through the narrow window in long, dusty beams, catching in the air between them. She did not speak at first, just looked around with quiet attention, taking in the walls lined with tools, the worn chair in the corner, the half-built table that waited for hands that had now chosen something else. Ethan stepped back once she was settled, not far, just enough to give her space, as if space was something she had been denied long enough to deserve now. "This is all I have," he said, voice even, not apologizing, not offering more than truth. Her eyes moved to him then, steady, thoughtful. "It is more than what I had 5 minutes ago," she answered, and there was no bitterness in it, just a simple accounting of facts. Outside, the sound of boots passed by slower than usual, voices lower, like the town itself was adjusting to something it had not agreed to but could not ignore. Word traveled quickly in places like this, faster than wind through dry grass. By the time the sun leaned west, everyone knew Ethan Cole had taken her in, and with that knowledge came distance, the kind that did not need to be spoken, the kind that showed up in empty doorways and jobs that suddenly belonged to someone else. He felt it before he saw it, the quiet withdrawal, the way Mr. Hargrove down at the general store avoided his eyes when he came in for nails, the way a conversation would pause just a moment too long when he stepped onto a porch, not rude, not direct, just enough to let a man know he had crossed a line no one had drawn out loud. He paid for his supplies, nodded like always, and walked back through the same streets that now seemed narrower somehow, like the space between people had grown tight with judgment. Back in the workshop, Clara had not moved much, but everything around her had. She had shifted a small box of tools closer, organized a pile of cloth Ethan used for wiping stain, even straightened the edge of the table that leaned unevenly against the wall. Small things, quiet things, but they changed the room, made it feel less like a place where work was done and more like a place where something might begin. "Again, you work alone," she said when he returned, not a question, more like an observation placed gently on the table between them. Ethan set down the sack of nails, brushed dust from his hands. "Most things worth building take time," he replied, and she watched him as he spoke, not just listening to the words but to the way he carried them, the weight behind them. Outside, a boy ran past, then slowed, then stopped just long enough to glance through the open door, curiosity pulling stronger than whatever he had been sent to do. Their eyes met for a brief second before the boy turned and hurried on. That was how it started, not with acceptance, not with kindness, but with noticing. Later that evening, as the heat softened and shadows stretched long across the dirt, Ethan dragged a chair closer to the workbench. One of his older pieces, solid but worn, the seat slightly uneven from years of use. He set it beside her, turned it, studied it like he was seeing it for the first time. Clara followed his gaze. "It leans to the left," she said quietly. Ethan gave a small nod. "It does," he answered, and for a moment neither moved, the silence between them not empty, just full of things not yet said. Then he reached for his tools, not hurried, not dramatic, just steady, like a man who had made a decision and did not need to explain it. Outside, the town settled into evening, lamps flickering to life one by one, voices carrying softer now. But every so often, someone would glance toward the edge of town where the small workshop stood, a place that used to mean nothing more than furniture and repairs, now holding something else, something people could not quite name. Inside, wood met steel, quiet, deliberate, the sound of something being adjusted, corrected, made right not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Clara watched his hands as he worked, the way he measured, paused, adjusted again, and for the first time since the wagon had left her behind, something shifted in her expression. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it, something careful, like a door opening just enough to let light in without trusting it would stay. And Ethan, without looking up, felt it, the change in the room, the weight of what he had taken on settling not on his shoulders, but into the work itself, because some things, Once you decide to carry them, do not feel like burdens anymore. They feel like purpose, and outside, though no one said it, the town had begun to watch more closely, because they could sense it too. Something was being built in that small workshop, and it was not just made of wood. Morning came without announcement, just a slow spill of pale light through the workshop window, turning dust into something almost golden. Ethan was already awake, not because he slept poorly, but because his mind had settled on the same thought it had carried through the night. The chair, he stood over it now, running his hand along the uneven edge, feeling where it leaned, where it failed. The kind of failure most people ignored until it broke completely. Behind him, Clara watched from the workbench, her posture straighter than the day before, not from strength in her legs but from something quieter, something rebuilding inside her. You do not fix it by forcing it straight, she said, her voice calm, like she had been thinking about it for a long time before speaking. Ethan did not turn right away, just paused, fingers resting on the wood. Then, how? He asked, not challenging, just asking. She shifted slightly, her hand reaching toward a small piece of scrapwood nearby. She picked it up, turning it slowly in her fingers. You find where it forgot how to carry weight, she said, placing the piece beside the chair leg. And you teach it again. The words settled into the room like something that belonged there. Ethan turned then, really looking at her this time, not as someone he had helped, but as someone who understood something he had spent years learning without ever putting into words. Outside, the town had begun its day, but it did not sound the same. The usual rhythm of hammering, voices, and horses carried a hesitation now, as if everyone was listening for something else beneath it. By mid-morning, the first knock came, not loud, not demanding, just two soft taps on the open doorframe. Ethan glanced up, surprised more by the presence than the sound. It was Mrs. Hargrove, standing with a basket in her hands, her eyes not quite meeting his. I had extra bread, she said, setting it down on a nearby table without waiting for an answer. Did not seem right to let it go to waste, she added. But her voice carried something else, something like uncertainty wrapped in habit. Clara inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, and for a moment, Mrs. Hargrove's gaze flickered toward her, not with judgment, not with pity, just seeing. Then she turned and left as quietly as she had arrived. Ethan watched her go, then looked back at Clara, who had already returned her attention to the chair. People do not change all at once, she said, almost to herself, the words barely louder than the scrape of wood against wood as Ethan adjusted the leg. The hours passed with a different kind of work, not just cutting and joining, but measuring again, listening, correcting. Ethan found himself pausing more, considering angles he would have rushed before, hearing her voice in small suggestions that shifted the outcome in ways he could not deny. By afternoon, the chair stood on its own without leaning, not perfect, but balanced, honest in its strength. Ethan stepped back, studying it, then looked at her. It holds, he said simply. Clara's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like one. Outside, another figure lingered near the edge of the property, a man this time, hat in hand, shifting his weight from one foot to the other before finally stepping forward. It was Samuel Pike, a farmer from the far end of town, known more for his stubbornness than his words. He cleared his throat before speaking. Heard you fix things, he said, eyes flicking briefly toward Clara before settling on Ethan. Got a gate that will not stay upright. The request hung in the air, ordinary on the surface, but carrying more weight than a broken hinge ever should. Ethan wiped his hands on a cloth, considering. He knew what this meant, not just work, but a small bridge being extended, fragile, uncertain. I can take a look, he said finally, not eager, not reluctant, just steady. Samuel nodded once, relief passing quickly across his face before he turned to leave. As the man walked away, Ethan glanced back at Clara, who was watching the doorway with quiet understanding. It starts like that, she said, her voice carrying something softer now, something that had not been there when he first carried her inside. Not hope exactly, but something that knew hope might come. Ethan picked up the chair, turning it in his hands, feeling its balance, its weight. Then he set it down beside her, closer this time, within reach, not as a gift, not as a statement, just where it belonged. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. the room holding that silence like it was something worth keeping. Outside, the town continued its slow shift, not loud, not proud, just a series of small decisions made one at a time, each one barely noticeable on its own, but together, changing something that had seemed fixed. And inside the workshop, where would met patience and quiet understanding, something else was taking shape, something that did not ask for recognition, did not demand approval, but would, in time, be impossible to ignore. By the time the sun dipped low enough to stretch shadows across the edge of town, the workshop no longer felt like a place set apart. It felt like a place people were beginning to circle back to, not boldly, not all at once, but in the quiet way folks returned to something they once ignored. Ethan stood outside for a moment, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. Watching the road where dust moved slow and steady under passing boots, he could feel it again. That shift, not as sharp as before, not as cold, something softer now, like hesitation turning into curiosity. Behind him, inside the workshop, Clara sat with the chair closer than before, her fingers resting along its edge as if reading it the way some people read a page, tracing the lines, the joints, the places where it held because someone had taken the time to make it hold. She had not said much since the farmer left, but her eyes had followed everything, every movement, every decision Ethan made. And when he stepped back inside, she spoke without looking up. "You changed more than the leg," she said. Ethan paused, glancing at the chair, then at her. "Had to," he answered simply. "One part does not stand if the rest forgets what it is meant to do." Clara nodded once, slow, certain, as if that truth reached beyond wood and tools. Outside, the sound of hooves approached, steady, unhurried, not the frantic kind that brought trouble, but the deliberate kind that carried purpose. Ethan stepped back toward the doorway, and there he saw it. A small wagon, not the kind used for long travel, but one built for town work, simple, sturdy, pulled by a tired horse that knew the road better than the man guiding it. The driver climbed down, brushing dust from his coat. It was Mr. Ellison, the man who ran the feed store, known for keeping to himself unless business required otherwise. He stood there for a moment, looking at the workshop, then at Ethan, then just past him toward Clara, not staring, not avoiding, just seeing. "Heard you might have a use for this," he said, stepping aside to reveal what sat in the back of the wagon. It was wood, not new, not polished, but solid, pieces of old fencing, a broken cart frame, things most would have burned or left to rot. But here, stacked carefully, like someone had thought twice before letting them go. Ethan looked at it, then at the man, understanding passing between them without needing words. "Appreciate it," he said, and that was enough. Mr. Ellison gave a short nod, climbed back onto the wagon, and left the same way he came. No lingering, no explanation, just the act itself. Inside, Clara watched the exchange, her expression unreadable for a moment, then softer. "They are not giving you charity," she said. Ethan shook his head, already moving toward the wagon to unload. "No," he replied, lifting the first piece of wood, testing its weight. "They are giving me something to build with." He carried the wood inside, piece by piece, stacking it along the wall where the light could reach it, each board different, each one carrying its own history of use, and where, Clara's gaze followed every movement, and when he set the last piece down, she spoke again, quieter this time. "That is how it begins," she said, not with apologies, but with offerings. Ethan leaned one hand against the stack, considering her words. Outside, a few more figures had slowed as they passed, not stopping, not yet, but no longer pretending not to see. The line between the workshop and the town was still there, but it had begun to blur, like chalk after rain. Later, as evening settled in and the air cooled enough to carry the scent of dry earth and distant cooking fires, Ethan dragged another workbench closer to Clara, setting tools within her reach without comment. She looked at them, then at him, a question in her eyes that did not need to be spoken. "You see things I miss," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, just as fact. Clara's hand hovered over the tools for a moment before she picked one up, turning it in her fingers with careful familiarity. "I see because I have had to sit still long enough to notice," she replied, and there was no shame in it, no bitterness, just a quiet strength shaped by time others had refused to give her. The lamp was lit as the last light slipped from the sky, casting a warm glow over the wood. The tools, the two figures now working side by side in different ways but toward the same end. Outside, the town did not sleep yet, but it had grown quieter, more thoughtful, as if something had shifted beneath its surface that no one could quite name but everyone could feel. And in that small workshop at the edge of it all, where a man had chosen to carry what others left behind, and a woman had begun to show what others had refused to see, the first real change did not arrive with noise or praise. It arrived with a wagon full of discarded wood and the simple decision not to throw it away. The next morning did not arrive quietly. It came with a problem, the kind that does not knock, but settles over a town like a weight no one knows how to lift. A section of the main water line had collapsed just beyond the well, not broken completely, but shifted enough that the flow slowed to a weak trickle, and in a place where every bucket mattered. That was enough to unsettle everyone. Men gathered near the well, hats low, voices tight, each offering a solution that sounded certain until it met the reality of warped wood and uneven ground. We brace it from the outside. One said. No, you reinforce the base, said another. But none of them moved to begin, because each idea carried risk, and risk meant responsibility, and responsibility meant being the one who got it wrong. The sun climbed higher, the line grew longer, buckets waiting, patience thinning, and still nothing changed. Word traveled the same way it always did, quiet at first, then faster, until it reached the edge of town where the workshop stood. Ethan heard it before he saw it. The shift in the air, the absence of the usual morning rhythm. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on a cloth, and caught sight of a boy running, not panicked, just urgent, heading toward the well. Ethan watched for a moment, then turned back inside. Clara noticed the change in his movement, the pause that came before a decision. Something is wrong, she said, not asking. Ethan nodded once. Water line, he replied, already reaching for his coat. Then he stopped, just for a second, his eyes flicking toward the tools laid out near her, toward the chair that now stood steady beside her. Toward her, Clara met his gaze, and there was something in it now that had not been there days before. Not uncertainty, not resignation, but clarity. Tell me what you saw last time it failed, she said. Ethan hesitated, not because he doubted her, but because the town did, and stepping into that space would mean bringing her into it, exposing her again to eyes that had only just begun to change. But the moment passed, replaced by something stronger. Then hesitation, he described it, the angle of the beam, the way the ground dipped slightly toward the east side, the way the support had been set too rigid instead of allowing for the natural shift of the soil. Clara listened without interrupting, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the workbench, tracing invisible lines as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for a small piece of charcoal and a scrap of wood, sketching quickly, not detailed, not perfect, but precise where it mattered. They are trying to hold it still, she said, drawing a short line beneath the first, angled just slightly. But it does not want to be still, it wants to settle. She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes fully. You do not stop that, you guide it. Ethan stared at the sketch, then back at her, the solution settling into place in his mind the same way her words had settled into the room. Simple, but not obvious unless you knew where to look. Outside, the town had begun to gather closer to the well, voices rising just enough to carry frustration. Still no action, still no movement forward. Ethan picked up the piece of wood with her drawing, holding it carefully, as if it carried more weight than it should. Come with me, he said, the words quiet, but final. Clara did not respond right away, her eyes searching his for something, perhaps permission, perhaps certainty. Then she nodded, once, steady. Ethan moved quickly then, not rushed, but purposeful. He adjusted the chair, lifting it slightly, testing its balance one more time before positioning it so it could be carried, not as a burden, but as something designed for movement. He gathered a few tools, slung them over his shoulder, then came back to her, lifting her the same way he had the first time, careful, measured, but now with a familiarity that made the act feel less like a rescue and more like a partnership. Outside, a few heads turned as he stepped into the road, carrying her again. But this time, the silence that followed was different, not heavy with judgment, but charged with something else. Anticipation, uncertainty. The town watched as he moved toward the well, the place where everyone had gathered but no one had acted, and when he reached the edge of the crowd, he did not push through, did not announce himself. He simply stopped, set her down where she could see, where she could speak if she chose. The men closest turned, some with surprise, some with hesitation. Samuel Pike was among them, his eyes moving from Ethan to Clara, then to the small piece of wood in Ethan's hand. "We have been at it all morning," Samuel said, not defensive, just stating fact. Ethan held out the sketch, not explaining, just offering, and for a moment, no one took it, not because they did not want to, but because they did not yet know how to. Then Samuel stepped forward, slowly, taking the wood, studying the lines drawn there, his brow furrowing, then easing, the idea settling in the same way it had for Ethan. He looked up, not at Ethan this time, but at Clara, really looking, as if seeing her not for the first time, but for the first time clearly, and in that moment, something shifted again, small, quiet, but undeniable, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything that follows. No one raised their voice, not at first, because something about that small piece of wood in Samuel Pike's hands had quieted the air more effectively than any command ever could. He turned at once, then again, eyes narrowing as he followed the charcoal lines, not drawn with flourish but with purpose, the kind of purpose a man recognizes when it matches something he has felt but could not name. "You are saying we let it move," he said finally, his voice lower than before, not arguing, just testing the idea out loud. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped slightly aside, giving Clara the space that had been denied to her so many times before. The crowd noticed that too. The way he did not speak for her, the way he did not shield her from their attention, but placed her within it. Samuel's gaze shifted to Clara again, and this time, he did not look away. "The ground will settle whether you allow it or not," she said, her voice calm, carrying just far enough for those closest to hear without needing to raise it. "If you force it to stay still, it will break again, maybe worse." A murmur moved through the group. Not disagreement, not agreement, just the sound of people adjusting to something unfamiliar. Another man stepped forward, older, shoulders worn from years of lifting more than most. He pointed toward the line. "We tried reinforcing it here," he said, tapping a section of wood that had been braced tight against the soil. It held for a while. Clara leaned slightly forward, studying the angle, the way the brace pressed too hard against one side. It held because the ground had not finished settling, she replied. "Now it is pushing back." The man followed her gaze, then nodded slowly, as if seeing it for the first time through her words. Ethan watched the exchange without interruption, his hands resting at his sides, ready but not leading. Samuel looked down at the sketch again, then back at the line, then at the men around him, something shifting in his posture, not authority exactly, but willingness. "We adjust it," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the others heard. "Loosen the brace. Angle it like this." He gestured to the drawing. "Let the ground settle where it wants, but guide it." For a moment, no one moved, not because they doubted him, but because they were crossing something invisible, a line that had been there long before any of them arrived, a line that said who was heard and who was not, who spoke and who listened. Then the older man stepped forward, placing his hands on the brace, not forcing, just testing. "Easy," Samuel said, and there was something different in his voice now, not command, but care. The brace shifted slightly, the tension easing just enough to allow movement without collapse. Another man joined, then another, each one adjusting, not rushing, not proving anything, just working. Clara watched closely, her eyes following every change, every small correction. "A little more to the left," she said once, quietly, and Samuel nodded without hesitation, repeating her words as if they had been his own thought. "Left, just a little." The line adjusted again, the wood settling into a new position, not rigid, not loose, but balanced. A moment passed, then another, and then someone lifted a bucket, dipping it into the flow. The water came steady this time, not strong, but consistent, enough. A breath moved through the crowd, not loud, but shared, like something held too long had finally been released. The older man leaned back, wiping his hands on his pants, looking at the line as if expecting it to fail again. But it held, not because it was forced to, but because it had been allowed to find its place. Samuel straightened, glancing once more at the sketch, then at Clara, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his expression. "That was your thinking," he said, not asking. Clara met his gaze, steady. "It was what the ground was already trying to do," she answered, and that was enough. No one laughed, no one dismissed it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition, small, quiet, but real. Ethan stepped forward then, not to take credit, not to explain, just to stand beside her, not in front, not behind, but beside, and the town saw that too. The way he did not claim what was not his, the way he allowed her place to exist without apology, one by one. The men returned to their work, not with the same hesitation as before, but with a different kind of focus, the kind that comes when something has been learned without anyone needing to say it out loud. A boy filled his bucket and paused, looking at Clara with open curiosity, then with something else, something like respect, before he turned and carried it away. And as the day moved on, the water continued to flow, steady, reliable, as if it had always been that way. But those who had stood there knew better. They knew what had changed was not just the line beneath the ground, but the way they had chosen to see the person sitting quietly at its edge. And though no one spoke of it, not then, not yet, the town had crossed something it could not easily return from. Because once you see clearly, even for a moment, it becomes harder to pretend you never did. The town did not celebrate, not out loud, not with cheers or raised voices, but something had settled into the air by late afternoon, the kind of quiet that follows when people realize they were wrong without needing to say it. Buckets moved again, steady and full. Boots returned to their usual paths, but the glances changed, slower now, more deliberate, as if everyone was measuring something new they had not accounted for before. Ethan carried Clara back the same way he had brought her, through the same streets, past the same porches, but the silence that followed them was no longer sharp. It had softened, like wood sanded down after years of rough use. No one called out, no one made a show of it, but a few heads nodded, small, almost unnoticed, the kind of acknowledgement that did not ask for attention, only offered it. Back at the workshop, Ethan set her down near the window where the late sun reached in. Long strips of light, dust drifting slowly through it. The same place she had sat before, but not the same place anymore. Not after what had just happened. He stepped back, giving her space again. Always that same quiet respect. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that does not need filling, because something had already been said without words. Clara looked out toward the road, watching the movement of people returning to their routines. Then she spoke, her voice softer than before but steadier. "They will not forget this," she said, not as a question, not as hope, just as something observed. Ethan leaned one hand against the workbench, following her gaze. "Some will," he answered, honest as always. "But some will not." Clara nodded slightly, as if that was enough, because in places like this, change did not need to be complete to matter, it only needed to begin. The door remained open as evening settled in, and for the first time since she arrived, it stayed that way on purpose, not by accident, not because Ethan forgot, but because he chose not to close it. A small thing, easy to miss, but meaningful in ways neither of them needed to explain. Footsteps passed by more often now, not stopping, not yet, but no longer avoiding the doorway. A man slowed, glanced in, then continued. A woman paused just long enough to look at Clara before moving on, each moment small, each one adding something unseen but real. Inside, Ethan returned to the stack of wood that had been brought earlier, running his hands over each piece, testing its strength, its grain, its history. Clara watched him, then shifted her attention to the chair beside her, the one that had been fixed, balanced, made right. She placed her hand on it, feeling its steadiness, then looked up at him. "You could make something better than that," she said, not dismissing the chair, but seeing beyond it. Ethan glanced over, curious. "Better how?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, not from doubt, but from choosing the right words. "Not just something that stands," she said slowly. "Something that understands who it is meant to hold." The words settled deeper than the ones before. reaching past wood and tools into something else, something harder to define but impossible to ignore. Ethan stood still for a moment, then nodded once, turning back to the wood, selecting a piece more carefully this time, not just for strength, but for shape, for possibility. Outside, the light faded further, the sky turning a muted shade of orange before slipping into blue. Lamps began to glow in windows across the town, one by one, steady and warm. And with them came a different kind of quiet, not the silence of avoidance, but the quiet of reflection, as if each person carried a piece of what had happened and was turning it over in their own way. Later, a soft knock came again at the doorframe, not hesitant this time, just respectful. Ethan looked up to see the older man from the well, the one who had first adjusted the brace. He stood there, hat in hand, posture straight but not stiff. "Line is holding," he said, simple, direct. Ethan nodded. "Good," he replied. The man shifted slightly, his eyes moving to Clara, and for a moment, there was something unspoken in his expression, something like gratitude that had not yet found its words. He did not say it, not out loud. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, placing it gently on the edge of the workbench. It was a tool, worn but well cared for, a measuring square, the kind passed down through years of work. "Figured you might put it to use," he said, then turned and left without waiting for a response. Ethan picked it up, turning it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the history in its edges. Then he set it down beside Clara, within her reach, not as a gift, not as a statement, but as something shared. Clara looked at it, then at him, and this time, the small curve at the corner of her lips stayed a little longer. Outside, the town did not change all at once, it never did. But something had shifted beneath its surface, something that would not easily return to what it was. And inside the workshop, where a door now remained open and a new piece of wood had been chosen with care, the next thing they would build had already begun, even if no one had yet seen its shape. The next morning did not wait for permission. It arrived with purpose, the kind that carries itself through a town before anyone names it. The workshop door was already open, same as the night before, but now it felt less like a decision and more like a habit forming. Ethan stood at the center of the room with the new piece of wood laid across the bench, measuring twice, then once more, not because he doubted his hands, but because something about this build required more than accuracy. It required understanding. Clara sat nearby with the measuring square resting in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges as if learning its history before using it. She watched him work, then spoke. "You are not building a chair," she said, and Ethan paused, not surprised, just listening. "No," he answered after a moment. "Not this time." She shifted slightly, setting the square against the wood, adjusting its angle just enough to change the line he was about to mark. "Then do not measure it like one," she said, the words simple, but they changed the space between them. Ethan looked at the line, then at her, then back at the wood, and without hesitation, he adjusted. Outside, the town had begun to move again, but something in its rhythm had altered, not louder, not faster, just more aware. A man slowed his horse near the workshop, not stopping, just looking. A woman carrying a basket paused at the edge of the road, glancing in before continuing, and then, for the first time, someone stepped fully inside without knocking. It was Samuel Pike, hat still on his head, boots dusty from the morning. He stopped just past the doorway, not uncertain, but respectful. "Line is still holding," he said, the same words as before, but this time they carried something more, not just report, but recognition. Ethan nodded once, then gestured slightly toward the bench, not inviting, not dismissing, just allowing. Samuel stepped closer, his eyes moving over the wood, the tools, then settling on Clara. He held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, the kind a man gives when he accepts something he once questioned. "You building something new?" he said, more observation than question. Ethan rested his hand on the wood, trying to. He replied. Samuel looked at the shape beginning to form. "The angle's different, the structure unfamiliar. Does not look like anything I have seen before," he added. Clara's voice came quietly, but clear. "That is because it is not meant to look like what came before." Samuel considered that, then stepped back slightly, not leaving, just giving space again. Outside, more people slowed, not gathering, not crowding, but watching in that same quiet way the town had learned. Inside, the work continued, not fast, not slow, just steady. Ethan cut along the adjusted line. The sound of saw against wood filling the room. Clara watched. The movement, the way the piece separated cleanly, then spoke again. It needs to support more than weight, she said. Ethan glanced at her, understanding already forming. Balance, he said, and she nodded. And dignity, she added, and that word stayed in the air longer than the others, settling into the wood, into the tools, into the hands shaping them. Outside, the sky shifted toward midday, the heat rising again. But it did not press as hard as before, maybe because something inside the town had shifted enough to make room for it. A child approached the doorway, slower this time, not running past, not hiding curiosity, just standing there, watching openly. Ethan noticed but did not stop. Clara saw the child and met his gaze, not smiling, not performing, just acknowledging, and the boy nodded once, small, then stayed, as if waiting to see what came next. Samuel remained as well, leaning lightly against the doorframe now, no longer an outsider to the space, but not claiming it either, just present. The first piece of the new build came together in Ethan's hands, not a seat, not a simple frame, but something shaped to hold differently, to support without forcing, to align with the body instead of against it. Clara leaned forward slightly, studying the joint. It will not hold if you treat it like the others, she said, and Ethan adjusted. Again, not resisting, not questioning, just refining. The afternoon stretched on, and with each piece added, the shape became clearer, not to the town outside, not yet, but to those inside, to the ones who had begun to understand that what was being built was not just for use, but for respect, the kind that does not announce itself, but changes how something is seen. As the light began to soften again, the first form stood on the bench, incomplete, but undeniable. Ethan stepped back, hands resting at his sides, studying it. Clara looked at it too, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she spoke. It will work, she said, not hopeful, not uncertain, just sure. Samuel pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer, his eyes moving over the form, then to Clara, then back again, and for the first time, he spoke without hesitation. You should be the one to use it first, he said, and the room went still, not because the words were loud, but because of what they meant. And outside, though no one had stepped in, though no crowd had formed, the town had already begun to listen, even if it did not yet know it was doing so. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room with a weight no one could ignore. You should be the one to use it first. And for a moment, everything stilled, not because anyone forced it, but because something had just been offered that had never been offered before. Not to her, not here. Clara did not answer right away, her eyes resting on the unfinished form on the bench, then lifting slowly to meet Samuel's gaze, searching not for permission, but for truth. And what she found there was not pity, not obligation, but something steadier, something earned. Ethan watched the exchange without stepping in, his hands quiet at his sides, allowing the moment to belong where it needed to. Clara drew a slow breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough. Then she nodded once, small but certain. When it is ready, she said, her voice even. And that was all, no more, no less. Samuel accepted that with a slight dip of his head, then stepped back again, returning to the place near the doorway, but not leaving. Outside, the light had shifted again, the long stretch of afternoon easing into something softer, and with it came more footsteps, not many, not all at once, but enough to be noticed. A woman paused just inside the threshold, holding a folded piece of cloth in her hands. She looked at Ethan first, then at Clara, then extended the cloth toward the bench. Thought you might need this, she said, setting it down carefully before stepping back, her voice quiet, her presence brief, but her choice deliberate. Clara's eyes followed her as she left, then returned to the cloth, her fingers brushing its edge, feeling the texture, the intention behind it. They are learning, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Ethan glanced at her, then at the form on the bench, then back again. So are we, he replied. The work resumed, but it had changed, no longer just shaping wood, but refining something that now carried more than function. Ethan adjusted the frame again, adding a support where it had not been before, angling it slightly, remembering her words, not just something that stands, something that understands who it is meant to hold. Clara leaned forward, studying the alignment, then reached for the measuring square, placing it against the joint, adjusting it just enough to correct what the eye alone might miss. It needs to meet her halfway, she said quietly, and Ethan nodded, making the change without question. Outside, a few more figures gathered at a distance, not crowding, not intruding, but watching with that same quiet attention that had begun to define the town's new rhythm. The boy from earlier still lingered near the doorway, now sitting on the edge of the step, chin resting on his hands, eyes fixed on the work as if trying to understand something beyond wood and tools. Inside, the final pieces came together slowly, deliberately, each joint set with care, each angle considered, until at last, the form stood complete on the bench, not polished, not perfect, but finished in the way that matters. Ethan stepped back, wiping his hands on the cloth, his eyes moving over it once more, checking not for flaws, but for truth. Clara looked at it too, her gaze steady. Then she shifted her hands to the edge of the bench, preparing. Ethan moved closer without a word, offering support, but not taking control. The room grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that gathers when something important is about to happen. Samuel straightened near the doorway. The woman who had brought the cloth paused just outside. The boy leaned forward slightly. All of them held by the same moment without needing to be told to stay. Ethan lifted her carefully, as he had before, but this time, there was a difference, not in the motion, but in the meaning. He was not placing her somewhere safe. He was placing her somewhere chosen. He lowered her onto the seat, slow, steady, allowing her to feel every part of it as she settled, the way it held, the way it supported without forcing, the way it aligned with her instead of against her. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, not long, just enough to take in what could not be seen. Then she opened them again, looking down at the frame, then at her hands resting comfortably, naturally, and something shifted in her expression, not surprise, not relief, but recognition, as if something that had been taken from her had been returned without anyone needing to name it. Outside, no one spoke, not because they did not feel it, but because they understood that some moments lose their meaning when filled with words. Samuel exhaled slowly, almost a breath he had been holding without realizing it. The boy sat back, eyes wide, not with confusion, but with understanding he could not yet explain. Ethan stepped back again, giving her space, always that same quiet respect. And for a moment, nothing moved, nothing needed to, because what had just happened did not belong to noise or celebration. It belonged to something quieter, something that would stay long after the moment passed. And in that stillness, the town saw it clearly, not what she lacked, but what she carried, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The moment did not end when she opened her eyes. It stretched, quiet and steady, like a beam set right, that does not need checking twice. Clara remained seated, her hands resting naturally along the sides, her back straight not from effort but from balance. And that alone held more weight than anything spoken. Ethan watched her, not looking for approval, not waiting for praise, just observing the way the structure held her without resistance, without forcing her into a shape she did not belong to. Outside, the town had not moved on. It had paused, not frozen, but attentive, like a field listening for rain. Samuel shifted his weight once, then stepped forward again, slower this time, more certain, his eyes moving from the chair to Clara, then to Ethan, and back again. "It fits," he said. Simple words, but different now. Not about the wood, not about the work, but about something deeper, something they all recognized without needing to name it. Clara inclined her head slightly, accepting the observation without claiming it. "It listens," she replied, and the distinction settled into the room like something important, something that would be remembered later when no one could quite explain why. The woman who had brought the cloth stepped closer now, not hesitant, not uncertain. She placed her hand lightly on the back of the chair, feeling its steadiness, then looked at Clara. "Does it hold you well?" she asked, not out of doubt, but out of care. Clara met her gaze, steady, calm. "It holds me as I am," she answered, and that was enough, more than enough. Outside, a few more people gathered, not forming a crowd, but no longer keeping distance, a quiet circle of presence, of witnessing. The boy at the doorway stood now, stepping just inside, his eyes fixed on the chair, then on Clara, then on Ethan, as if trying to understand how something so simple could change so much. Ethan moved then, not to adjust, not to fix, but to clear the bench, setting aside the tools, the scraps, the pieces that had led to this, making space not just for work, but for what would come next. Clara shifted slightly in the chair, testing its support, the way it moved with her instead of against her. And there, in that small motion, was something no one had seen before, not because it had not existed, but because no one had made room for it. Samuel noticed it too, the way her posture changed without strain, the way her hands rested without gripping, and something in his expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "We have been building things wrong," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Ethan did not answer, because there was nothing to add. The truth had already been spoken. Outside, the light began to fade again, casting long shadows that reached into the workshop, blending the inside and outside into one continuous space, no longer divided by a doorway or a line of sight. The town stood there, not asking questions, not demanding explanations, just present. And in that presence, something else began to form, not loud, not declared, but real. The older man who had brought the measuring square stepped forward again, this time without hesitation. He looked at Ethan, then at Clara, then back again. "If you are making more of those," he said, nodding toward the chair, "I have a few folks who could use one." The words were practical, grounded, but they carried something more, an opening, an acknowledgement that what had been built was not just for one person, not just for one moment, but for something larger. Ethan glanced at Clara, not for permission, but for alignment, and she gave a small nod, the same kind she had given before, steady, certain. "We will," Ethan said, and that was all. No promise beyond what could be kept, no claim beyond what had been proven. The boy stepped closer then, reaching out a hand, not to touch the chair, but to hover just above it, as if respecting something he did not yet fully understand. Then he looked up at Clara. "Did it hurt before?" he asked, the question simple, honest. Clara considered him for a moment, then answered just as simply, "Only when no one noticed." The boy nodded, absorbing that in the way children do, without argument, without doubt, and stepped back. Outside, the town began to move again, not away, but forward, people returning to their paths, their work, their routines, but carrying something new with them, something that would change the way they built, the way they saw, the way they chose. Inside, Ethan picked up a fresh piece of wood, setting it on the bench with the same care as before, but now, there was no uncertainty in his hands, no hesitation in his movement, because what they had done once could be done again, and not just repeated, but understood. Clara rested in the chair, not as someone placed there, but as someone who belonged there, her presence no longer a question, no longer a burden, but a part of the work itself. And as the last light of the day settled into the corners of the workshop, one thing became clear, not in words, not in declarations, but in the quiet way people had begun to act. The town had not been changed by force, or by argument, or by spectacle. It had been changed by a man who chose to stop, and a woman who showed them what they had been too busy to see. And now, there was no going back to the way things had been, because once something is built right, even the ones who ignored it before can feel the difference when they sit down. The next days did not arrive with noise or announcement. They unfolded the way well-built things do, steady, quiet, and undeniable. The workshop became something more than a place at the edge of town. It became a place people found reasons to pass by, not all at once, not boldly, but in small, deliberate steps. A man with a stiff back stopped to ask about a seat that would not strain his spine. A woman with tired hands lingered long enough to wonder if something could be made that did not force her to lean. Each question simple, practical, but carrying the same quiet shift beneath it. They were no longer asking if something could be done. They were asking how it could be done differently. Ethan worked without changing his pace, still measuring, still cutting, still listening. But now there was a rhythm to it that included others, the sound of footsteps pausing at the door, the murmur of voices that no longer avoided the space, The presence of people who once looked away and now chose to stay. Clara remained at the center of it without ever stepping into the middle. Her voice came when needed, not often, not loud, but always precise. That angle will press too hard after an hour, she would say, or that edge needs to give, not resist. And each time, the work adjusted, not because she demanded it, but because it proved true. The town began to notice that too, not just that she spoke, but that what she said held. The first new chair was finished before noon on the third day. Built for the man with the stiff back, he arrived early, hat in hand, standing just inside the doorway with a posture that carried both doubt and hope. Ethan guided him to the seat, not explaining, not convincing, just allowing the man to try. He lowered himself slowly, cautious at first, then settled, his shoulders easing in a way they had not in years, his breath shifting, deeper, steadier. And when he looked up, there was no surprise in his eyes, only recognition, the kind that comes when something feels right without needing proof. Feels like it was made for me, he said, and Clara, watching from her place near the window, answered quietly. It was made to understand you. The man nodded, not questioning, not arguing, just accepting. And that was how it spread, not through stories, not through praise, but through use, through experience, through the simple act of sitting and feeling the difference. Outside, the town adjusted again. The distance that once surrounded the workshop disappeared without anyone marking the moment it happened. People came and went without hesitation, without glancing over their shoulders, without lowering their voices. The line between the center of town and the edge no longer held the same meaning, because the edge had become something else entirely, something essential. Samuel Pike returned more than once, sometimes with questions, sometimes without, standing near the doorway, observing, learning in the quiet way men like him did. One afternoon, he stepped inside with a piece of wood under his arm, not discarded, not worn, but chosen. He set it down on the bench, then looked at Ethan, then at Clara. Figured this might be better than what I have been using, he said, and there was no pride in it, no reluctance, just a simple offering. Clara ran her fingers along the grain, then nodded slightly. It will hold, she said, and Samuel gave a small nod in return, as if that was all he needed to hear. The boy who had first lingered at the doorway now came inside without stopping, sitting near the corner, watching the work with a focus that had grown into something deeper. He began to ask questions, not many, but enough. Why does that one lean forward? Or why is that piece thinner? And each answer built something in him that went beyond the workshop, something that would stay long after he left. The older man who had brought the measuring square returned too, not with tools this time, but with stories, quiet ones, about how things used to be built, how they failed, how they could have been better if someone had only taken the time to listen. And Clara listened to him the same way she listened to everything, not interrupting, not correcting, just taking in what mattered and letting the rest fall away. Ethan noticed that too. The way she gathered knowledge, the way he gathered wood, selecting, shaping, refining, until it became something useful, something strong, something that lasted. And in all of it, there was no announcement, no declaration of change, no moment where the town stood together and agreed on anything. It happened in smaller ways, quieter ways, a chair placed in a home that eased a tired back, a bench built that did not strain a worker's knees, a doorway that remained open because no one thought to close it anymore. And through it all, Clara remained where she had always been, not at the center of attention, but at the center of understanding. Her presence no longer questioned, no longer explained, simply accepted, as necessary as the tools on the wall or the wood on the bench. And Ethan, who had once carried her because no one else would, now worked beside her as if it had always been that way, as if there had never been a time when the town could not see what stood right in front of them. And maybe that was the quiet truth settling in, not that something new had been created, but that something valuable had been there all along, waiting for someone to stop, to notice, and to build around it instead of past it. There was no single day the town could point to and say this is when everything changed, because by the time anyone thought to look for it, the change had already settled in, quiet and permanent like a foundation laid right the first time. The workshop no longer stood at the edge of anything. It had become a place people moved toward without thinking, without hesitation. The road leading to it carried more footprints now, more wool tracks, more signs of use, not because it demanded attention, but because it had earned it. Ethan worked as he always had, steady, patient, hands moving with purpose shaped by years. But there was something different now, not in what he did, but in how the work moved around him. It was no longer solitary, no longer contained within the walls of the workshop. It extended outward, carried by those who had sat, who had felt, who had understood. Clara sat near the window where the light still found her each morning. But even that had changed. The light no longer felt like something reaching into a quiet room. It felt like something joining what was already there. She had become part of the rhythm, not as an addition, not as an exception, but as something necessary. Her voice came when needed, and when it did, it was no longer met with hesitation. It was met with attention, the kind that comes from trust earned slowly and held firmly. One afternoon, as the air carried the first hint of cooler days to come, a wagon stopped outside the workshop. Not unusual now, but this one held something different. Not wood, not tools, but people. 2 men climbed down first, then helped a third, older, slower, his steps careful, measured, the kind of movement that spoke of years spent adjusting to discomfort no one else could see. They guided him inside, not with urgency, not with concern, but with respect. And when they reached the center of the room, they stopped, looking not at Ethan, not at the tools, but at Clara, as if they already knew where the answer would come from. The older man removed his hat, holding it in both hands. "Heard you make things that do not fight back," he said, his voice rough but steady. Clara met his gaze, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present. "We make things that listen," she replied, and the words carried the same quiet certainty they always had. Ethan stepped forward then, not leading, not directing, just beginning the work. The process repeated itself, but it never felt like repetition. Each piece of wood chosen with care, each angle considered with purpose, each adjustment shaped by understanding rather than assumption. The older man watched, not speaking, just observing, and when the time came, when the seat was ready, when the form had taken shape in a way that matched not what it looked like, but what it needed to be, he sat, slowly, carefully, and then, for the first time since he had entered, he exhaled fully, not forced, not controlled, just natural, the kind of breath a man does not notice until he has gone too long without it. His hands rested at his sides, not gripping, not bracing, just resting. And when he looked up, there was no question in his eyes, no doubt, just a quiet understanding that something had been given back to him that he had not thought to ask for. The 2 men who had brought him exchanged a glance, not surprised, not amazed, just certain, as if they had known this would happen the moment they chose to come. Outside, the town continued as it always had, but not quite the same, never quite the same again. The sounds of work, of life, of movement carried on, but beneath it all was something steadier, something built not from noise or force, but from a series of quiet choices made by people who had learned to see differently. Samuel Pike stood near the doorway that afternoon, watching as the older man rose from the seat with less effort than he had used to sit, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softer, as if something inside him had settled into place. He looked at Ethan, then at Clara, then back at the workbench where a new piece of wood had already been set, ready for the next build. "You ever think about what this place used to be?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a comparison, just as a thought spoken aloud. Ethan considered it for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said, simple as always. Samuel nodded once, understanding more in that answer than in anything else that could have been said, because what the place had been no longer mattered, not when what it had become was already taking root. Clara watched the exchange, her hands resting lightly on the arm of the chair, the same chair that had started it all, the one that now felt less like a beginning and more like a foundation. And in that moment, with the light fading gently through the window, with the sound of quiet work continuing around her, with the presence of people who had once looked away now choosing to stay, there was no need for words, no need for recognition, because the change had already happened, not in a single act, not in a single moment, but in the steady, patient way that real things are built, one choice at a time, until they become something that does not need to be explained, only lived. Out here, People like to believe change comes with noise, with a moment you can point to and say that was it. That was the turning point. But the truth is quieter than that. It settles in slowly, like dust after a long ride, until one day you look around and realize nothing feels the same. The workshop stood in that quiet truth now, not new, not grand, but steady in a way that did not need to prove itself. The door was open as it had been for many days, but no one thought of it as open anymore. It was simply the way things were. Ethan moved through the space with the same measured rhythm, hands worn, steady, shaping another piece of wood that would soon become something someone needed, not something someone wanted. And that difference mattered more than most ever understood. Clara sat where the light met the floor. The same place, the same chair, but not the same meaning. Not anymore. Her presence had shifted from being noticed to being expected, and there is a difference between those two that no words can fully explain. Outside, the town moved with its usual pace, but there was a softness to it now, a willingness to pause, to look twice, to listen where once it would have passed by. A man adjusted a bench outside his store after noticing how it forced customers to lean. A woman shifted the height of her table after realizing how it strained her back. Small things, quiet things, but they carried the same understanding that had begun in that workshop and spread without anyone claiming it. Samuel Pike stood at the edge of the doorway again, not as a visitor, not as an observer, but as someone who had become part of the rhythm. He leaned lightly against the frame, arms crossed, watching Ethan work, then glanced at Clara, who was tracing the grain of a new piece of wood with her fingertips, not testing it, not measuring it, just understanding it in the way she had learned to understand everything else. Samuel spoke after a while, his voice low, thoughtful. "Strange thing," he said. "We all thought strength meant holding things up." He paused, looking around the workshop, then back at the street. "Turns out it means knowing how to let them settle." Ethan did not stop working, but he nodded once, the motion small but certain. Clara looked up then, her eyes meeting Samuel's, and there was something in that exchange that needed no explanation, no agreement spoken out loud, just recognition, the kind that settles deeper than words ever could. The boy who had once stood at the doorway now moved freely through the workshop, carrying small tools, placing them where they belonged, not because he had been told, but because he had learned by watching, by listening, by being allowed to stay. He paused near Clara, looking at the chair she sat in, then at the one Ethan was building. "Will they all be different?" he asked. Clara considered the question, then answered, "They will all listen differently." The boy nodded, as if that made perfect sense, and maybe it did. Maybe some things only sound complicated until someone says them the right way. Outside, the sun began to lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the town and into the workshop, blending the two spaces into one, no longer separate, no longer divided, just connected in a way that had not existed before. A wagon passed by, slowing slightly as it neared the open door. The driver glanced in, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, as if checking in on something that had become part of his route, part of his understanding of the place he lived in. Inside, Ethan set the final piece of the current build into place, securing it with care, then stepped back, not to admire it, not to judge it, but to see if it held true. Clara watched, her gaze steady, then gave a small nod, and that was all the approval needed, not because it came from her, but because it came from understanding. Samuel pushed himself away from the doorway, stepping fully inside, not stopping at the threshold, not lingering at the edge, just walking in as if he had always belonged there. He looked at the new piece, then at Ethan, then at Clara, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say something more, something larger, something that could carry the weight of what had changed, but he did not. Instead, he gave a small nod, the same kind that had passed between them before, quiet, certain, enough, and then he turned, stepping back out into the fading light. The town continued around him, unchanged in its shape, in its buildings, in its roads, but altered in something harder to see, something that lived in the way people now chose to act, to notice, to build. Back inside, the workshop settled into its evening rhythm, tools set down, wood stacked, the day's work complete, but never really finished, because work like this does not end, it continues, one piece at a time, one person at a time. Clara rested her hands on the arms of the chair, feeling its steady support, not as something given, but as something that now belonged to her. Ethan moved to close the door, then paused, his hand resting on the frame. He looked out at the street, at the movement of people, at the place that had once turned away and now no longer did. Then he let the door remain open, not as a gesture, not as a statement, but because there was no longer any reason to close it, and that was how it ended. Not with applause, not with words, but with a door that stayed open, in a town that finally learned how to see what had been there all along. Because out here, justice does not always arrive on horseback. Sometimes, it sits quietly in a chair, waiting for someone to notice that it was built right all along.